Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this final lunch lecture of the year 2023. We're very delighted this afternoon to welcome as our guest speaker Camille Bernardt. Camille is a PhD candidate at the VUB, so at the Vrije Universiteit Brussels, and also at the University of Warwick. Camille's PhD research focuses on the relationship between different forms of polarization and democracy. So I think there's a clear link here also to the disinformation topic that we have been discussing over the course of these different or these various research lunch lectures. And specifically, Camille is interested in the boundary between harmless and harmful forms of polarization. So today he will give us some insights into his research. I would welcome you all to post any questions that you might have regarding the talk in the Q&A chat that you can find at the bottom of the screen, and we'll address those at the end of the lecture. So without further ado, Camille, I would like to give you the floor, and we look forward to your talk.
Thanks. Yeah, thank you all for being here. Thank you all also at the EDMO lunch lecture series for having me, or us, I should say, because this is, of course, a collaboration between Didier, my supervisor, Benjamin, my great colleague, and myself. And also, before I start, just to stress, this is based on a paper that we already published. So if you're interested in looking at it in more detail, you can always find it on online. It's open access. So I put the screenshot of the paper in the on the slide here. So the theme of today, or the theme of our paper, is on institutional design and polarization in general, and more specific than how some democracies are more susceptible to polarization than others. And yeah, Tom already briefly mentioned it, but this is a more general overview of my PhD. As he said, it focuses on one hand on how the democratic institutions affect polarization and its negative consequences. On the other hand, it looks at which types of polarization are most detrimental for democratic societies. And it's, of course, on the left-hand side that this paper is located, the paper that I will explain here in more detail. So as a matter of introduction, it's something that you often hear. We're in this so-called age of polarization. We are confronted with many events in the world, in society, that seem to confirm this idea. There has been the Yellow Vest movement in France already 5 years ago. There have been COVID lockdowns in Belgium, which also have resulted to some protests and clashes with police in Brussels 2021. There is, of course, what some people call the perfect example of how polarization can turn very badly, which is the storming of the US Capitol on January the 6th, 2021, in Washington, D.C., where, as you all know, some angry supporters of the presidential candidate Trump, were storming the Capitol to demand that their false belief that the election was stolen that the election was overturned and that Trump could become president nevertheless, which is, of course, quite a quite intense example of how polarization can have some real dangerous consequences for democratic societies. And then there is, of course, also very recent example of the whole discussion, polarization, debate on what is happening in Gaza at the moment, which also has led to fierce differences and fierce forms of polarization within society in general, I think, not only here in the West, but all over the world. But before I go into the more recent examples that I explained and also the more recent trends that we see, I briefly wanted to give you a more historical account to show you that actually we are, of course, in a polarized time, but that it is not as bad as it has been in the past. These are the graphs from the graphs that I made, from the VDEM dataset, the Varieties of Democracy dataset that we also use in our in our paper, in which I extended the time span, because we only focus on the time span between 2000 and 2019 in our paper, but here I extended it towards 1900, just to give you an idea. The blue line is identity-based polarization, and the red line is idea-based polarization. But for idea-based polarization, sorry, the data only range from 2000. And there you can see that indeed in the 2000s, in all regions, it has been increasing, but that you should bear in mind that, for example, in Western Europe, during the interbellum years, it has been much worse. And especially in Eastern Europe during the Cold War, identity-based polarization has been much higher than it is today. But that's, of course, a side note that I just wanted to make. If we now focus on the time span that we're interested in, since 2000s, the time frame or the period when it started rising again, as you can see here, also in the West, but also in other countries, something happened around 2000s, because then polarization started to rise again. But then still, I want to draw your attention to the fact that we focus on Western Europe and North America in our paper as well, that it's still quite significantly lower than in other political regions. Identity-based polarization and idea-based polarization are both below the global averages. So that's also something that I think you should take or you should hold in mind when discussing this age of polarization. But of course, what we are more interested in, apart from the time-based trends, is comparing individual countries, because the baseline from where we started this analysis or this paper is the remarkable differences there are between, on the one hand, countries like Denmark, Lithuania, Germany, Norway, Sweden, etc., but also Belgium and Luxembourg, who are quite low in terms of polarization. I mean, their strength of polarization is much lower than, or the levels are much lower than in other countries like the US, the UK as well, France, Poland, Hungary, which have much higher levels, of polarization. And this graph shows the average over 20 years for both of them. And blue is identity-based, and yellow or orange is idea-based. And I come back on this distinction in a couple of slides. But you can see in both of them, there's major differences between countries. And that's, of course, what the main argument of this paper is trying to find where these differences can be located, or what the reason for this can be, and then more specifically focusing on institutional design. But before we go to institutions, there has been some other research, of course, going on explaining these rising levels of polarization, or polarization in general, both at the individual and at the macro level. There is, of course, the very important element of media and communication. I probably shouldn't tell you this because you're much more specialized in all of this than I am. But literature is quite agreeing on the fact that social media, disinformation, different forms of communication all contribute to rising levels of polarization. There is also in American literature this idea that social norms have been decreasing and that this has facilitated polarization. There is this decline in institutional trust, decline in social cohesion. Also this idea of social sorting. Social sorting is the fact that people increasingly want to concentrate themselves amongst like-minded people, both politically and socially. And this, of course, then also leads to the fact that group identities become stronger, and that the polarization between groups also increases. Economic inequality, although there the evidence is mixed, and the winners-losers thesis of globalization is also often portrayed as one of the causes of polarization. But we, of course, want to focus on something specific, which is the role of institutions, because we argue that there are different types of democracies, and not all democracies work in the same way, first. And second, the differences in those democracies mostly deal with how democracies or how institutions manage societal conflict and power sharing. All countries or all societies are characterized by some level of conflict. That's inevitable. But the extent to which this conflict translates into polarization and more severe forms of conflict depends on to a certain extent on the type of institutions you have within that democracy, and that's why we argue that it's very interesting to also look at the institutional variety that exists to try explaining the differences in the levels of polarization. And previous studies in that regard have already focused on the risk of civil conflict and war, but they have not really looked at polarization to the extent that we do it, at least not at the time that we were writing this article, which is 2021, if I'm not mistaken. So before I go into the explanations, then the reasons why these institutions then have an effect on polarization, I just want to briefly say something more about the differences between the types of polarization that I explained already before or touched upon before. Because as you know, polarization is a deeply contested phenomenon. For me as a researcher, that's sometimes really frustrating, but also for the bigger public, I feel people are often talking about different things when they're talking about polarization, which is one of the reasons why we in this paper wanted to have a clear definition of what we exactly mean with polarization, and we started from the idea that it's au fond, or how do you say that, like fundamentally about increasing distance between actors. But here in our paper we looked at the more macro level. And we looked at it as a process in which actors develop increasingly distant social relations and or become more distant in how they feel towards each other. And that's then based, and here I come to the distinction, that's then based on the type of conflict that underlies this form of polarization. Which type of conflict leads to this increasing distance between actors, either in social relations or in how they feel, is often based on the type of conflict that underlies there. And in the case of idea-based polarization, as the name itself says, it's more about conflict about different conceptions of reality, differences in how people look at the world, but also differences in how they think the world should be governed, etc., etc. So it's really about idea-based differences. Examples are issue polarization, moral polarization, ideological polarization, etc. While identity-based polarization could also be, of course, starting from a sort of idea-based conflict, but there the polarization, the distance between the actors, is much more about the identity that the opposing actors have and the group identities that they have. So it's more about how those groups make sense of themselves and of others. That drives this type of polarization. And in that regard, affective polarization is the most well-known subform in the literature today. You probably already heard of it. It is the form that is also related to the most detrimental consequences to democracy. As of now, people or scholars are also most worried about this form. And it's basically often measured as the distance in how you feel towards one group versus another group. So for example, if I feel very good or very warm towards a certain party, but very cold towards another party, then my affective polarization will be quite high. While when I would feel the same towards all, it would be quite low. But that's just an example of this more identity-based polarization. Okay, then in the second step, we looked at the institutional variation. So how now does this institutional variation possibly affect the levels of polarization and why? So there we drew heavily on the typology of institutions made by Arend Leipart in his seminal work, his book in 2012, in which he distinguishes between, on the one hand, consensus democracies and on the other hand, majoritarian democracies. And as the word itself already kind of explains it, consensus democracies really strive for a sort of inclusion of as many societal groups as possible, striving for consensus between all those groups, while majoritarian democracies attach much more value on the numbers, you could say, on the majority of people, instead of looking for a consensus between all the different groups in that society. And Leipart thereby also distinguishes between two dimensions, what he calls of power sharing. On the horizontal level, consensus democracies are characterized by oversized coalitions, multi-party systems, and very importantly, the idea of proportional voting or proportional electoral systems, in which the amount of votes that a certain party gets is proportionally related to the amount of seats or the amount of or the intensity of representation, you could say, he gets in the representational body like parliament. While in the majoritarian democracies, the horizontal power sharing is characterized by minimal winning coalitions, two-party systems like the US, very good example, and majoritarian electoral systems, also very important. That means that, for example, winner takes all or first past the post, that the distinction or the division between the division of the seats at the federal or at the national level, you could say, or at the representative body in general, is not proportional but majoritarian, meaning that the majority gets much more than the minority. So that's the horizontal level, and at the vertical level, he also distinguishes between federalism and strong bicameralism on the side of consensus democracies, while majoritarian democracies are much more likely to be unitary states and have unicameral system, meaning that's only one chamber of legislation. But that's on the vertical level. So applying that idea on polarization, we had three main hypotheses. First, we hypothesized that indeed consensus democracies will be related with less polarization, and we had four reasons to hypothesize this. First of all, the fact that in democracies that have a more consensus-based institutional design, that their connectedness between the political groups in society will be higher because they're more inclined to work together. They're more inclined to respect each other, to include each other in political decision-making, but also in cooperation, etc. This in turn will foster connectedness between those political groups, which will then possibly relate to less polarization. Secondly, there is also the idea that in consensus democracies, there is broader institutional support and a higher satisfaction with democracy amongst both the winners and the losers of an election, which is also quite important because of the fact that when the power is equally distributed between people that have participated in the elections, meaning that small parties also get elected, then people that are on the losing side are often more likely to accept the result or be satisfied with the result than people that have seen their vote completely cast away, for example, in majoritarian systems where it's just winner takes all. Then there is also a limited incentive for party political bloc formation. This means that given that small parties also can get represented or also can get elected, they have a lesser incentive to work together, to click together in a bigger bloc to be able to be represented, which then in turn might have led to polarization. In consensus democracy, that's the case, which is a third reason why we think it will also be less polarized. And fourthly, and that's kind of related to the first point, cross-cutting identities are also more easily formed in consensus democracies. This means that different identities that not necessarily overlap are still instigated in that kind of system in which there is a lesser chance that two opposing blocks will form, but more different blocks that constantly overlap. And this, of course, then also leads to less, or might lead to less polarization, which is then, of course, our first hypothesis. Secondly, as a counter hypothesis, we also know that consensus institutions entrench and reproduce those political identities, which then might also lead to more instead of less polarization. And we also know that consensus institutions are complex, which often lead to lower accountability and responsiveness of the elites, which also might actually increase rather than decrease the levels of polarization in a country. And thirdly, we also hypothesized that the effects or the relationships that we thought of, that they will be stronger for identity-based than for idea-based polarization. First of all, because almost all the mechanisms I just explained deal with identity-based polarization and not necessarily with idea-based polarization. And also because institutions act as a pressure release valve, we call it, for identity-based conflict and not necessarily for idea-based conflict. With that, I mean institutions that are, for example, allowing the pressure that boils up in a society naturally that are allowing this pressure to be released, for example, by including different groups, being sure that everyone is represented, that this argument is more related to identity-based conflict than to idea-based conflict. Because, for example, parties are also more identity-based groups than they are idea-based groups. Yeah, so that's the general argument there, which then leads us to say that the effect will just be stronger for identity-based polarization, because everything that we said here does not necessarily apply also for idea-based polarization, or not to the same extent, you could say. So then what did we do, and how did we came with our up with our results? We took data from the VDEM dataset, as I already said. There we chose the two variables that overlap with our idea of identity-based and idea-based polarization. It's important to keep in mind that those are expert coding variables. That means that different experts in different countries were asked to code or rank their own country in certain time points on those questions. So, for example, is society polarized into antagonistic political camps for identity-based, and how would you characterize the differences of opinions on major political issues in this society for idea-based polarization? So those experts had to give those codes themselves, meaning, of course, that it does not come directly from citizens living in that country, which, of course, is open to criticism. But we still chose these variables because they're quite robust. We checked it with some robustness checks, but also because they are the most, how do you say that, the most complete in time, in the time frame that we wanted to look, and also the most, they're the most wide in scope of all the countries, of all the data sets that we found. And then for the institutional variables, we took data from the CPDS, the comparative political data set. And there we took variables for every institution that we were interested in. Two of them, electoral proportionality and effective number of parties, were continuous, and all the rest was categorical. So we dummified them to be able to check the effect of them. And then we also included some controls, the fact that polarization will be affected by institutions probably after a couple of years only, not directly, not in the first year that you measure. This is why we also added time-lagged effects and some year dummies as well, because of course the data goes both over years and over countries. And then we did a linear or less regression on those 36 countries that I showed in the first graph, or the second graph or something. So what did we find? Well, institutions do matter. This is just copied from the graph that you have, that you can find, sorry, in our article. First of all, we find that electoral proportionality is indeed related significantly with less identity-based polarization. Secondly, the government type, and in this case, multi-party coalition cabinets, are also, and even more strongly, related with less identity-based polarization at a significance level of 0.031. And then federalism was the strongest effect. There we found that, strongly federal states are indeed even more or even less likely to be identity-based polarized than no or weakly federalized states. For idea-based polarization, we found somewhat similar results, but they were less significant. For example, the effect of electoral proportionality was negative as we expected, but not, marginally significant. The others were not significant. The only thing that was significant is the federalism index here. So also in the case of idea-based polarization, we find that strongly federalized states are indeed less polarized at the idea-based level in general than no or weakly federalized states. So what does this mean for our hypotheses, and also what does this mean for you to remember? Consensus institutions indeed reduce polarization, and they do so more than majoritarian institutions. Specifically, federalism, electoral proportionality, but also multi-party coalition government, they are all related to less identity-based and idea-based polarization. So we can confirm our first hypothesis. And the effect was indeed clearly stronger for identity-based polarization. So also there, the third hypothesis was accepted. But what does this now mean for you to take home? And just to give you the overview of the differences between the countries again, I just highlighted here Luxembourg and Belgium because they're, of course, most of interest probably to you. You indeed see that both of them consensus-based democracies. You indeed see that they're both quite low on the level of identity-based and idea-based polarization, which is partly, of course, not fully, but partly the result, or partly due to the fact that those are consensus-based democracies. So to go back to that slide, institutions striving for consensus are indeed related with less polarization. That's the take-home message. So countries that organize or that manage the conflict within their societies in a way that as many people are included as possible, so striving for consensus, those kind of countries are indeed related with less polarization. So therefore, the distribution of power is there very important. And just to give you a small sneak peek of another paper that we're working on, in which we looked at the effect of polarization on political violence. So once countries are polarized, I mean, all countries are polarized to a certain extent, but once you take polarization as a given and you then check whether it leads to also more political violence, which is of course much more problematic. That's what we did in another study with 136 countries over a longer period, over 60 years. There we found that indeed polarization leads to violence globally, but that participation, the degree to which, and that's the same idea of what I just explained, the degree to which groups and people are included in the society or in the system, that there, as you can see here on those graphs, that there the chance that polarization leads to violence is actually diminished. That's what those graphs tell you. For example, at the global level, you see the extent that polarization rises, political violence also rises, but the interaction of the participation index is significant, meaning that the more participatory countries are, the less political violence will actually occur from more effective polarization. I know it's a lot, but it was just to show you that that this idea that the more you participate in government, the more you allow the organization of conflict to be inclusively organized, the less are the chances that polarization will occur and that polarization will lead to negative consequences. But before I end, just a warning, which you always will hear in this kind of research. Of course, correlation is not causality. We didn't find effects. We only found relations, correlational relations, meaning that countries that are more consensus based will but are related with less polarization. But there is no causal link that we found because of the fact that this correlational data. Also, the expert ratings already explained that, but that's also quite important that you keep that in mind. This research should ideally be to be done again with attitudinal research, with research that looks at what people actually think themselves. And also, we had no results on precise mechanisms. So we had only results on the relationship, but we didn't check why this was the case, and we only hypothesized about that. But nevertheless, you could say that the first pillar of my research hereby is somewhat answered, being that power distributing institutions, are related to less polarization, and that they also mitigate the most harmful consequences. So thank you very much. If you're interested in reading more, you can always look at the article itself. It's open access, and you can find it on the website of the journal, or you could also send me an email to talk more about this. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Camille, for a very interesting presentation, also very clearly explained. So if people have questions, feel free to post them in the Q&A chat, so you can see the button at the bottom of your screen. So maybe to get the discussion started a little bit, I have one question, and I think you already teased it a little bit in your presentation as well, this idea that well, there might be different kinds of polarization, and that not all of them might be necessarily bad or as bad as the other. And my question relates in particular to this concept of ID-based polarization. So I wonder if you could explain a bit more what exactly it means, if a society or a country that you looked at is based is polarized in terms of ideas. And I was wondering if you couldn't turn that around and maybe also say that it, yeah, somehow affords or allows for a diversity of ideas and how that relates to this concept of opinions or of polarization rather, sorry.
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. I'm also kind of struggling with when I'm talking or thinking, brainstorming about polarization, and also about the relationship with democracy, because indeed, as you say, arguably, democracies are or need a sort of idea-based differences. That's the way we progress. That's the way we came up or we come up with new ideas with progress. The question then is, of course, yeah, if you're looking, it first starts, of course, with definition. What do you think of when you think of polarization? Idea-based polarization, I argue, would be in your case when you think about ideas really in a practical sense, for example, issues or ideologies, or then it's the distance between them. And so the higher the distance becomes, the more polarized a country is, meaning that, for example, yeah, conservatives are becoming more conservative and liberals are becoming more liberal. Then you have a classical form of stronger idea-based polarization. But then relating that to democracy, of course, yeah, you could argue, even some scholars or some philosophers do so. For example, Chantal Mouffe says that, yeah, this form of increasing polarization in that sense is not a bad thing. In to the contrary, even we need this clash of ideas. Where it becomes problematic, of course, is when it translates to not necessarily identity-based polarization, but forms of polarization where people do no longer respect each other's opinions and see each other as, yeah, as enemies. That's the idea of agonistic versus antagonistic polarization that she also talks about. I mean, she talks about conflict, but I apply it also to polarization, in which the idea is that, yeah, when you are more antagonistically polarized, that means that you see the other as an enemy and also as not worthy to be part of your political community. And then, of course, we are in a context where political violence might occur, where intolerance might occur, etc. But that's, of course, something completely different than disagreeing about liberalism or conservatism or whatever. I hope that answered the questions.
Yeah, thank you very much for the clarification. So in the meantime, we also have a question in the chat, a question by Victor. And Victor wants you to go back to the slides where you present the evolution over time of these measures of identity-based polarization and ID-based polarization. And I think it's again a question for clarification. So whether you could tell us a bit more about how these things were measured over time, and if you could expand a little bit on the evolution that can be seen here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, those are the same data as we use in our paper. So it's VDEM data. It's also by default expert-based or expert coding. So for example, if you take a random year, 1925, what you see here in this specific graph is the mean of all countries in the Middle East and North Africa that were coded in 1925. That would be this point. And then it evolves over time. So the idea really is that coders were asked, but it goes even further for this. It goes on into 1900 for this variable, but for some variables, it goes back to 17 and something. There people were asked, experts, academics were asked to say, yeah, in 1900, Lebanon, how much was it polarized on a scale of 0 to 4? And then in that resulting from that, I calculated the mean scores per political region, and then I plotted it over time. So that's basically how it's organized. Regarding the evolution, I'm not an historian. I'm just a political scientist, so I don't know why exactly this. I mean, I have ideas, but I'm not sure why exactly. For example, in the Eastern Europe and Central Asia region, it's higher during the Cold War. I could give some hypotheses, but I'm not sure. So I'm not sure whether I should comment on that. But that's really the idea of this graph. I hope that answers the question.
Yes, I think it answers the question very well. I know when I look at these graphs, one thing that strikes me, of course, is that starting from around 2000, all of these somehow seem to go up. And yeah, looking at it through the lens of yeah, digitalization and social media, I wonder if that has something to do with it also, because what you see also, well, I don't know if you could somehow overlay it with the adoption of certain media and so forth over time, whether you would see some parallels there as well. Or I don't know if you have any thoughts about that specifically.
Yeah, I think I'm not an expert on that because I deliberately focused distanced myself from that literature because it's something completely different, but of course related. But I know that there is literature on this, and indeed that I don't know whether it's historically also true as you say it, that it overlaps with the adoption of those media, but we find strong effects for social media. For example, the whole echo chambers idea, but also for other concepts that have been proposed within that literature, and we indeed clearly see that yeah, social media have not really helped in this whole idea of increasing polarization, rather to the contrary. But I don't know the specifics, so I leave that to the real experts here.
Yeah, thank you very much, Camille. So there's another question in the chat, a question by Trisha. So I'm just going to take a look. So the question is, are there any explanatory factors such as social cohesion or trust in institutions that you find compelling? So the question is, yeah, where do we need to look for solutions when we look when we go forward in this? So should we radically reorganize government, which is probably unlikely to happen? But where would you look indeed for solutions based on what you've seen in the data and in your research?
Yeah, good question. We of course focused on institutions mainly, and yeah, the results were quite clear as well. But if you look at the most classical example of where it goes bad today, which is of course the US, but also the UK to a certain extent, yeah, we don't think it's a coincidence that those are also majoritarian systems. The fact that, especially in the US, where yeah, Democrats are always yeah, contrasted with Republicans, or even yeah, put up against each other in ways that are institutionally yeah, facilitated. It's very difficult to be a median voter in the US. You always have to pick sides, or you don't vote at all, because yeah, another vote doesn't really count because of the first past the post system and the winner takes all system. So what we find in this research, but also in the other research that I briefly touched upon in the end, is that I would and we would encourage every policymaker that has anything to do with institutional design is always bear that in mind. Be sure that all the different identities within society, all different groups within society, have equal or quasi-equal access to power. Because if you don't do that, then not only will people be less satisfied with democracy, but they will also become more polarized, and even the chances for political violence and intolerance are becoming higher. But that's of course from a global level. I mean, that's from a comparative level between countries. That's a macro level thing. At the more individual level, there are also other mechanisms at play there that I'm not really sure about. They of course always relate to this idea of managing societal conflict. But there, yeah, access to social media is of course also something that can work in both ways. But there, I'm not sure. I think the most important thing, or the take-home message here, is that yeah, it's really important, not just from a principle standpoint, but also from data-driven standpoint, that that different yeah, identities have to be represented. Otherwise, polarization will increase.
Okay, thank you very much, Camille. And maybe one question to follow up on that and to maybe look a bit closer to home also. So if you think about what we've seen in the Netherlands with the elections recently, and also looking ahead towards the elections that we'll have in Belgium in June, you can argue, of course, we have these consensus-based democracies, but still after the election, the big narrative that comes up is that yeah, a lot of people apparently still didn't feel weren't heard enough or couldn't get their voice to be heard and so forth. So I wonder if based on again your research and what you've seen from these numbers and looking at different countries, yeah, what are your, I wouldn't say predictions or maybe expectations, or what can you tell us about the relation between polarization and democracy if you look at the Belgian situation, for instance?
Yeah, it's a good question indeed. I mean, I kept on telling you that Belgium is a very good example of a consensus democracy, and indeed in the data, we didn't look at specific countries, but Belgium is less polarized. I showed you in the beginning, and still, indeed, then seeing that in the Netherlands as well, that Geert Wilders is doing so good, and that also Vlaams Belang here in Flanders is gaining votes, but also PTB or PVDA on the other side is indeed kind of contradictory to this idea. So I'm really aware that this kind of contradicts the findings, and I think it's maybe to some extent also because of the fact that these effects are always they take time to materialize, because if we're talking about institutions, on the one hand, that's the first part, and secondly, also there's also still very much variation at the individual level, and also at how politicians fulfill the role that they are given. We also see intensification of the, I mean, of how do you say that, toxification of the debates between politicians. That wasn't really the case before, also in this kind of democracies or governments. So although we know, of course, from the correlational findings that we here have, that consensus democracies are still better at coping with polarization than majoritarian democracies. That does not mean that they are immune, of course, quite to the contrary. So I would say keep on investing in those institutions, and not like Bart de Wever proposed some time ago to go to majoritarian system in Belgium as well. I think that would be a terrible idea, especially given the fact that we have so many identities within our country, ingrained in our country. So that would be a terrible idea. But that does not mean that having consensus democracy solves all your problems, of course. So I don't know where it will end. That's an open question for me and for you as well. So I wish I could answer, but I'm not sure.
Thank you very much. But to follow up on that, I was just wondering in the data that you look at, so respondents are asked to indicate for their country whether it's a consensus-based democracy or not, and so forth. I wonder if you could somehow add an additional variable or an additional feature there where rather than in absolute terms indicate whether it's like on paper a consensus-based democracy or not, like the question could also be how it's perceived, because I have the impression that in Belgium there's a narrative also going around that we're no longer really a consensus-based democracy, but that ministers and so forth, they get swapped out seemingly at random without ever consulting the population about that. So maybe that could also be an additional factor that comes into play.
Yeah, absolutely. These are, of course, objective data. I mean, those are data that have not been compiled by individual citizens. So we don't know from these data how citizens would perceive, but we do know that the differences are often quite big between what experts think a country looks like and what individuals living in that country actually perceive. So I wouldn't be surprised if you indeed would find that many people in Flanders or in Belgium even say that Belgium might be a consensus democracy, but we don't really see that in our specific lives. But that's of course always a problem between, or the difference between what is and how it is perceived. But good point.
Okay. Well, There's a few comments still in the chat. So Trisha points out indeed that in the US, for instance, that the role of the media cannot be underestimated, that this is indeed divided amongst partisan lines, and that shifts in narratives indeed are an important factor to take into account. I think we already covered part of that also in the talk. So I think if there are no additional questions, we can wrap it up here. So thank you very much, Camille, for a really fascinating talk. I think everyone will agree that this was very insightful. We learned a lot, and we'll definitely take a look at your paper as well. And do keep us posted when the new research is coming out, because I think it's really fascinating stuff and very well done also. So with that, as I mentioned, we wrap up this cycle of lunch lectures for this year. I think it was definitely last but not least this talk. So do keep an eye on our website and the mailing list for the upcoming talks. So we'll probably still have a few in the beginning of next year. And again, if you have any further questions, remarks, or want to reach out to our speakers, feel free to send us an email. And as I mentioned, keep an eye on the website for new updates. So thank you all for joining, and have a great rest of the week.
Thanks.